Look at her, what a mess!
Oh my God, Emily, what's with the hoodie?
Yeah, it's like you're hiding.
Seriously, so lame. No wonder you're always alone. Why are you doing this? Just leave her alone!
Whatever, let's go.
Hello family, welcome to Threshtail Stories, where every story feels real. Please subscribe and leave a comment. It truly means a lot to us. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and loved ones and turn on your post notification so you never miss a new story. Thank you for watching and supporting us.
At exactly 9:42 p.m., the quiet hum of a suburban American high school turned into something no one there would ever forget. For years, Emily Carter had been the kind of student most people overlooked. The one who sat in the back of the classroom, kept her head down, and carried the weight of whispered jokes and sideways glances that followed her through crowded hallways. To her classmates, she was an easy target, someone they could mock without consequence, someone they believed would never fight back. But on that night, something shifted in a way no one expected because Emily had been watching, listening, and remembering far more than anyone gave her credit for. What began as a moment of cruelty, another clip recorded for laughs and shared across social media, quickly turned into the spark that set everything in motion. And when she finally decided to act, she didn't just respond to the bullying she endured, she revealed something that reached far beyond teenage cruelty and into a place that made even the adults uneasy. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. And when she exposed their secret, it didn't just destroy reputations. It opened the door to questions no one in that town was prepared to answer. Questions about trust, authority, and how long the truth had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone like Emily to finally bring it into the light. So what really happened that night at 9:42 p.m., inside a school that had always been seen as safe, predictable, and untouched by anything serious enough to make headlines beyond sports victories and graduation rates? Who were the students everyone admired, the ones with the polished reputations, the ones teachers trusted without question and parents pointed to as examples of success, and how much of that image was real? Perhaps the question that lingered the longest: how did Emily Carter, the same girl who had spent years being ignored, dismissed, and quietly pushed aside, manage to uncover something that had gone unnoticed by everyone else, including the very adults responsible for protecting students like her? The answers didn't come all at once, and they didn't come easily because every layer that was uncovered seemed to lead to something deeper, something more complicated than anyone had first imagined. What started as a story about bullying quickly raised a different possibility, one that made people uncomfortable because it forced them to consider whether what Emily did was an act of revenge fueled by years of pain or something else entirely, something closer to justice. And as more pieces began to fall into place, another question started to take hold, one that no one could ignore anymore: just how deep did the secret really go, and how many people had seen parts of it but chose to look away, assuming someone else would deal with it, until Emily Carter decided she wouldn't stay silent any longer. To understand how everything reached that point, you have to go back to who Emily Carter really was before that night, beyond the version most people thought they knew. At 16, Emily wasn't loud or attention-seeking, and she didn't try to compete for popularity in a school where image often mattered more than character. She was observant in a way that many people overlooked, the kind of person who paid attention to details others ignored, who noticed tone, timing, and the small inconsistencies in people's behavior. At home, she was raised by her father, a retired police officer who believed strongly in accountability, discipline, and the idea that truth always reveals itself eventually. He never saw his daughter as weak even when she struggled socially, and he often reminded her that silence doesn't mean absence, it just means patience. Those lessons stayed with her even when the hallways of her school made her feel invisible. Across that same school, there was another group everyone seemed to notice. A circle of 4 students often referred to as the elite group, known for their confidence, influence, and the kind of reputation that made teachers trust them and other students want to be around them. They were athletes, social media personalities, and familiar faces at every major school event, the kind of students who appeared to have everything under control. Their image was consistent, polished, and carefully maintained, and to most people there was no reason to question it. They were involved in leadership programs, volunteer activities, and had strong relationships with faculty, especially with Mr. Reynolds, a respected staff member who had been part of the school for years and was known for mentoring students and guiding them towards success. From the outside, everything about that group and their connection to authority looked normal, even admirable. But Emily saw things differently, not because she was looking for trouble, but because she noticed patterns that didn't quite make sense. There were moments that stood out to her: late evenings when certain members of the elite group stayed behind after everyone else had left, conversations that abruptly stopped when someone else entered the room, and a subtle shift in behavior from one student in particular, someone who had once seemed confident but now appeared tense, distracted, and unusually quiet. These were small details on their own, easy to dismiss if you weren't paying close attention, but Emily had a way of holding onto those observations, connecting them over time without fully understanding what they meant yet. At first, it all looked like typical high school drama, the kind of social tension that comes and goes without lasting consequences, but Emily was beginning to realize that there was something more beneath the surface, something that didn't fit the image everyone else believed so easily. And the more she paid attention, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that what she was seeing wasn't random at all, it was connected in a way that hadn't been revealed yet, a pattern forming quietly in the background while everyone else remained focused on appearances. What followed didn't happen all at once, and that's what made it harder for anyone else to notice. It began with small moments that seemed insignificant on their own, a comment in class that drew laughter at Emily Carter's expense, a misplaced assignment that someone had quietly interfered with, a group chat she was never part of but somehow always the subject of. Over time, those moments became more coordinated, more deliberate, as if someone had decided she was the easiest person to turn into a target. The elite group never acted in obvious ways that could easily be reported, instead they operated through influence, through subtle encouragement. Through knowing exactly how far they could go without crossing a line that would bring consequences. For Emily, it wasn't just the actions themselves, it was the consistency, the feeling that it was being orchestrated rather than random. Then came the moment that changed everything, the one that spread faster than anything before it. A video appeared online, recorded during school hours, showing Emily in a situation that had been carefully set up to make her look foolish, isolated, and unaware of what was happening around her. Within hours, it was being shared across platforms, viewed by students, alumni, and even people outside the school community. Comments began to pile up, some mocking, some indifferent, and others simply watching without saying anything at all. For most people, it was just another viral clip, something to react to and move on from, but for Emily, it was different. She didn't just see what everyone else saw, she watched it again and again, not focusing on herself, but on everything else happening in the frame. It was during one of those repeated viewings that something caught her attention, something subtle that would have gone unnoticed by anyone who wasn't looking for it. In the background of the video, partially obscured and easy to miss, there was an interaction between members of the elite group and Mr. Reynolds. It wasn't obvious, and it wasn't something that immediately raised alarms, but there was a familiarity in the way they spoke, a level of comfort that didn't match the usual boundaries between staff and students. More importantly, there was timing, the kind that suggested this moment wasn't accidental, that it had been planned or at least allowed to happen under circumstances that raised questions. That was the turning point for Emily Carter, the moment when the situation stopped being just about her and started becoming something else entirely. Instead of reacting emotionally in the way others might have expected, she became focused, methodical in a way that reflected the lessons she had learned from her father. She began to go back through anything she could access, old social media posts that had been edited or deleted, comments that no longer appeared publicly, connections between students that didn't seem obvious at first but became clearer when viewed together. She paid attention to patterns of communication, to who appeared where and when, and to the gaps in information that suggested something had been intentionally hidden. The more she looked, the more she realized that the video was not just an isolated act of bullying, it was part of a larger structure, one that relied on control, influence, and the assumption that no one would ever question it. There were links between members of the elite group that went beyond friendship, shared moments that pointed to coordination, and interactions with Mr. Reynolds that felt increasingly difficult to explain as coincidence. Each piece on its own might not have meant much, but together they formed something that Emily could no longer ignore, something that suggested this situation had been building for longer than anyone realized. And as she continued to connect those pieces, one thought became impossible to dismiss. What she had uncovered wasn't just about what had been done to her, it was about something much bigger, something that had been hidden behind reputation and trust for far too long. What happened after that discovery was not a sudden confrontation or an emotional outburst, but something far more deliberate. Emily Carter didn't rush to tell anyone, and she didn't try to defend herself publicly. Instead, she did something most people in her position wouldn't think to do. She started building a timeline. Drawing from everything she had observed over the past months, she began organizing events, conversations, and interactions into a sequence that made sense. Dates, locations, who was present, and what had changed afterward all became part of a larger picture she was slowly assembling. It wasn't perfect at first, but as she revisited old details, more connections began to emerge, and what once seemed like isolated moments started to align in ways that were difficult to ignore. As Emily went deeper, she began to see patterns that extended beyond her own experience. There were other students who had quietly withdrawn from activities, students who had once been active and confident but suddenly kept to themselves, and in some cases, students who had transferred without much explanation. When she looked closely, she noticed that many of those students had crossed paths with members of the elite group at some point. It wasn't enough to prove anything on its own, but it raised questions, and Emily knew that questions, when pursued carefully, could lead to answers. She also began to recognize that the influence of the elite group wasn't just social, it was structural, supported by a level of trust from faculty that gave them freedom others didn't have. The more she uncovered, the more it seemed that the group had been doing more than just maintaining their image. There were signs of manipulation, subtle pressure placed on other students to stay quiet, to go along with certain narratives, and to avoid speaking about things that didn't feel right. There were inconsistencies in how situations were handled, small incidents that should have been addressed but were instead dismissed or overlooked. And at the center of it all, appearing again and again in ways that became harder to explain, was Mr. Reynolds. His involvement wasn't obvious in a direct sense, but his presence in key moments, his influence over decisions, and his close connection with the elite group suggested that he was more than just a passive observer. Still, not everything Emily found pointed clearly in one direction, and that uncertainty became part of the challenge. There were moments when it seemed possible that she was connecting dots that didn't belong together, that what she was seeing could be explained by coincidence or misinterpretation. Some of the information she came across was incomplete, and some of it came from sources that were difficult to verify. It raised the possibility that what she believed she was uncovering might only be part of the truth, or perhaps something entirely different. The idea that she could be overreacting crossed her mind more than once, especially when she realized how serious the implications could be if she was right. At the same time, something else was happening, something that made it clear she wasn't the only one paying attention anymore. Members of the elite group began to act differently around her, their confidence replaced with a level of awareness that suggested they knew something had changed. Conversations would stop when she approached, and there were moments when it felt like she was being watched, not openly, but in ways that made her presence noticeable. It wasn't direct confrontation, but it was enough to create tension, enough to suggest that her quiet investigation was no longer entirely hidden. That tension came to a point one afternoon when someone approached her, not aggressively, but with a seriousness that stood out. The words were simple, delivered without raising their voice, but they carried weight in a way that was hard to ignore. They told her she didn't understand what she was getting into, that there were things she couldn't see yet, things that could affect more than just her if she continued. It wasn't a threat in the obvious sense, but it was a warning, and it confirmed something Emily had already started to suspect, that what she was uncovering mattered to people who didn't want it exposed. By that point, Emily Carter had gathered more than just observations. She had patterns, connections, and enough information to begin forming a clear picture of what had been happening behind the surface. The pieces fit together in a way that pointed to something organized, something that relied on silence and trust to remain hidden. She knew that if she chose to act, she could bring it into the open. She could expose everything she had uncovered and force others to see what had been overlooked for so long. But there was one thing she hadn't fully realized yet, one piece of the situation that had not yet come into focus, and it was something that would change the outcome in ways she couldn't predict. Because by now, Emily had enough evidence to expose them, but what she didn't realize was who else was involved. By the time everything reached its breaking point, the question was no longer whether something was wrong. It was how far it extended and who had allowed it to continue. Emily Carter had spent weeks connecting details that most people had either missed or chosen not to question, and what she uncovered made one thing clear: the elite group had not been operating on their own. Their confidence, their ability to avoid consequences, and the consistency of their influence pointed to something larger, something supported from within the system itself. At the center of it all was Mr. Reynolds, a figure no one had ever seriously doubted, someone whose role in the school gave him both authority and trust, the kind of trust that made people less likely to question his decisions. The deeper Emily looked, the more undeniable his involvement became. It wasn't just about being present at the wrong moments or showing favoritism, it was about patterns of protection, situations that should have led to disciplinary action quietly dismissed, complaints that never moved forward, and students who had tried to speak up but were met with silence or subtle pressure to let things go. There were indications that certain behaviors had been overlooked intentionally, that reputations were being preserved at the expense of those who didn't have the same level of influence. The elite group benefited from that protection, and in return they maintained the image that helped keep everything in place. It wasn't chaos or carelessness, it was control, maintained through trust and the assumption that no one would challenge it. Emily understood that revealing something like this couldn't be done halfway. If she was going to expose the truth, it had to be undeniable, something that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. The opportunity came during a school event, a gathering where students, staff, and even parents were present, a setting where attention was already focused and where information could spread instantly. It was the kind of moment where everything could either fall apart or finally come to light. Emily had prepared for it carefully, organizing the evidence she had collected into a sequence that told a clear and direct story. When it happened, it didn't begin with an announcement or a warning. The information appeared all at once: videos that showed interactions no one had questioned before, messages that revealed coordination behind the scenes, and recordings that connected individuals in ways that couldn't be ignored. At first, there was confusion, people trying to understand what they were seeing, trying to make sense of how it all fit together. Then the realization began to settle in, and with it came a shift in the atmosphere that no one could stop. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, attention turned, and the focus moved toward the truth that was unfolding in front of them. The reactions came quickly after that. Students who had once followed the elite group without hesitation began to distance themselves, uncertainty replacing confidence. Staff members who had trusted the system they were part of found themselves questioning how much they had overlooked. Mr. Reynolds, once seen as a steady presence, was now at the center of something that could no longer be ignored. There was no way to contain it, no way to redirect attention once the evidence had been seen. Within minutes, the situation escalated beyond the control of the school itself. Authorities were contacted not as a precaution but as a necessity, because what had been revealed was no longer just an internal issue. It had moved into a space that required investigation, accountability, and answers that the school alone could not provide. What began as a personal experience for Emily Carter had become something much larger, something that forced an entire community to confront a reality they had not expected to face. And in that moment, as everything shifted from silence to exposure, one thing became clear: the truth had been there all along, but it took someone who refused to stay invisible to finally bring it forward. As the immediate shock began to settle and the investigation moved forward, something unexpected started to unfold, something that complicated the story in a way few people had anticipated. One member of the elite group, someone who had once stood at the center of everything, chose to speak. It didn't happen publicly at first, and it didn't come with the confidence people had associated with that group. Instead, it came quietly during questioning, when the weight of everything that had been revealed made it impossible to maintain the same version of events. What they admitted shifted the narrative, not by removing responsibility, but by adding context that forced people to look at the situation differently. They spoke about pressure, about expectations that went beyond social status, about a system where going along with certain actions felt safer than questioning them. There was fear involved, fear of losing reputation, opportunities, and the approval of someone in authority who had made it clear, directly or indirectly, that silence was expected. That confession didn't erase what had happened to Emily Carter or to others who had been affected, but it introduced a level of complexity that made the situation harder to define in simple terms. It raised questions about influence, about how far responsibility extends when individuals are operating under pressure, and about how easily environments can be shaped in ways that discourage people from speaking up. For investigators, it provided another layer of evidence, one that supported the patterns Emily had uncovered. For the community, it forced a difficult conversation, one that went beyond assigning blame and into understanding how something like this could develop without being challenged sooner. As the investigation progressed, the consequences became more concrete. Actions were taken that confirmed the seriousness of what had been uncovered. Mr. Reynolds was removed from his position as authorities examined his role in the events that had taken place, and members of the elite group faced disciplinary measures that reflected their involvement. The school, once known for its stability and reputation, found itself under scrutiny, with questions about oversight, accountability, and how warning signs had gone unnoticed for so long. What had been exposed by Emily Carter didn't just affect individuals, it reshaped how the entire institution was viewed, both internally and by the wider community. Through all of this, Emily did not step forward as someone seeking recognition. She didn't present herself as a hero, and she didn't attempt to control the narrative that followed. Instead, she returned to a quieter place, not the same kind of silence she had lived in before, but one shaped by the understanding that what she had done carried weight far beyond her own experience. People who had once overlooked her now saw her differently, not because she demanded it, but because her actions made it impossible to ignore the role she had played in bringing the truth forward. Respect replaced indifference, not through attention or praise, but through acknowledgement of what it took to do what she did. At home, the moment that defined everything for Emily came not from the public response, but from a simple conversation with her father, a man who had spent years in law enforcement, who understood both the importance and the cost of standing up for the truth, looked at his daughter and said something that stayed with her long after everything else had settled. He told her that she didn't just stand up for herself, she did what others were too afraid to do. It wasn't said as a celebration, but as recognition, a reminder that courage often comes quietly and without guarantee of outcome. In the end, what remained was not just the story of what had happened inside that school, but the larger question it left behind. It challenged the assumption that authority alone ensures justice, and it highlighted the role individuals play in shaping the environments they are part of. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from systems or structures designed to enforce it, sometimes it comes from the one person who refuses to stay silent, the one who sees what others overlook and decides that ignoring it is no longer an option. So what do you think after everything you've just heard, after following Emily Carter from the moment she was overlooked and dismissed, through the night that changed everything and into the truth she uncovered piece by piece? Was she right to expose them the way she did, knowing it would disrupt lives, damage reputations, and force an entire community to confront something it had ignored for far too long? Or do you believe she went too far, that there might have been another way to handle it without setting off consequences that no one could control once they began? And if you place yourself in her position, carrying the same weight of silence, the same pattern of being pushed aside, the same realization that something deeper was happening right in front of you, would you have done the same, or would you have walked away and left it for someone else to deal with? Because what makes this story stay with people isn't just what happened inside that school, it's what it says about how easily truth can be overlooked when it's hidden behind reputation, authority, and the assumption that someone else is paying attention. Emily Carter didn't start out trying to change anything beyond her own situation, but what she discovered forced her into a position where doing nothing was no longer an option. And that decision, whether people agree with it or not, is what ultimately brought everything into the open. It reminds us that situations like this don't begin with one moment, they build over time, supported by silence, by hesitation, and by the belief that speaking up might not make a difference. And if this story shocked you, if it made you question how something like this could unfold without being challenged sooner, then there's another case, one that remained hidden for decades, where the truth didn't come out until long after the damage had already been done. A case that raises even more difficult questions about trust, accountability, and how long silence can last before someone finally decides to break it. Stories like these aren't just about what happened, they're about what we choose to see and what we choose to ignore, and how those choices shape the outcomes for everyone involved. So as you think about everything that happened to Emily Carter and everything she uncovered, consider what it reveals about the systems we rely on and the people within them. Because in the end, the difference between something staying hidden and something being exposed often comes down to a single decision, whether someone is willing to speak when everyone else stays quiet. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that challenge assumptions and make you look at familiar situations in a different way, subscribe for more real stories that make you question everything.